Welcome to this short WiseOwl tutorial on using precedence constraints within SQL Server Integration Services. Here's what we'll learn in the tutorial. We'll begin by looking at normal constraints, so I'll show you how to get a task to run depending on the completion status of the previous one. We'll then go on to look at expression constraints, so I'll show you how to set expression constraints and how to switch between them all having to be true or any one of them having to be true. So let's get started. To explain how constraints work, I've created a package which asks the question, is cricket boring? I think we all know the answer to that. There's two possibilities, yes or no. So if I try running that package, you'll see it comes up with a relevant question using a script. If I were to answer yes, which is the correct answer of course, that would be deemed to be a success and I would go down this green path. And you'll get a message saying you've chosen the correct answer. If I answer no, you'll instead go down the failure path and you'll get a message saying you've chosen the wrong answer. And whether I answer yes or no, I'll automatically go down the completion path because the task completed, and I'll log the fact an answer was given. So let's try. Firstly, I'll say no, it isn't boring. That's the wrong answer. So it's displayed that in a script going down this path. And you can see the task failed. If I try doing that again, but this time answer correctly and say cricket is boring, then I've gone down the success path and got a message saying it's the right answer. Whichever I did, whether I chose yes or no, this log the fact an answer was given task completed. And in fact, if I now go to the log file created from that, which I put here, and double click on it, you can see the last two times I ran the task have been logged. It took me 13 seconds between one and the other. So, how did that work? Well, the is cricket boring script had a message box within it, which I'll just illustrate, just in case you've never seen this before. And what that does is set a variable called answer to hold the result of a dialog box and ask the question, is cricket boring? And the configuration buttons are that you can have a yes and a no button. If somebody answers yes, then the result is deemed to be a success. And what I did is just copied and pasted that script to say that otherwise the result would be deemed to be a failure. So that's how I got this to work. What I want to do is show now how to configure these constraints. And to illustrate that, I've created a simpler version of this, a template version, which contains all the same tasks but not joined together. What I then did is I dragged the green success arrow from my initial question onto the other three tasks. I then right-clicked on this one and chose that this logging task should run under all possible circumstances that the previous one completed, and the arrow turns black. I then right-clicked on this other constraint and chose that this should run if the previous task failed. So what's happening here is the script is determining whether it was a success or failure, and that determines which path we'll go down. And to be honest, I think that's probably all there is to say about precedence constraints. So we'll now have a look at expression constraints instead. To illustrate how expression constraints work, we're going to go back to our familiar X Factor contestants workbook. It's based on the popular UK reality TV show, and we've got three worksheets. We've got 109 finalists, we've got 9 series, and we've got 10 mentors, the people who advise the contestants. And what I've done is created a package which imports this information into 3 separate SQL Server tables. So there's 109 contestants, I've got my series table with 9 series, and I've got my mentors table with 10 mentors. So what actually does this? If we have a look in Integration Services, here's my package. What it does firstly is to run an execute SQL task to get rid of all the old records, and then it runs 3 separate data flow tasks to import the contestants, series and mentors, at the same time counting how many records there are. It stores that information in 3 variables which I've created called number contestants, number mentors and number series. And finally, it uses a script to display the results of those variables so we can see how many records we've imported. And then it has a file system task to copy the workbook to another folder. If we have a look at one of these sample data flow tasks, this is what it does. It takes an Excel workbook of contestants, for example, counts how many there are with a row count transform, and then puts the results into the SQL Server table. So if I run that, it will all run completely normally because there's no constraints in whatsoever, and it says how many contestants, mentors and series I've got. What I'm now going to do is to add constraints saying that the final two tasks, these bottom two, will only run if I have at least 100 contestants, so far so good, at least 10 mentors, and at least 10 series. And because there's only 9, these bottom two tasks won't actually run. So let's do that. To add a constraint, or rather an expression constraint, you right click on an existing constraint and choose to edit it. You can then change it from a normal constraint to an expression one. And then you can specify what the expression should be, which has to be true for the next task to run. So you can click on the 3 dots, and in my case I'm going to drag down the number contestants variable and say that it has to be greater than or equal to 100. If I evaluate that, it's a bit misleading. Because the value of the variable is currently 0, it will actually give me false. But when I run the actual package, this variable will be populated with 109 and the condition will be true. So if I choose OK for that, and I'm going to do the same thing for the other two constraints quite quickly. So I'm going to turn them both into expression tasks. This one should be that the number series has to be greater than or equal to 10. And the final one should be that the number of mentors has to be greater than or equal to 10. And you can see I've set constraints, expression constraints, because of this little symbol appearing on each of the constraints. If I run this now, I won't see the message at the end. And the reason for that is while 2 of these constraints were true, the third one wasn't. So what we're now going to do is look at how to make it so these final 2 tasks will run if any one of these constraints is true. In the previous part of this tutorial, we created 3 constraints, which said that the number of contestants imported has to be at least 100, series has to be at least 10, and the mentors has to be at least 10. But the problem is, because only 2 of those 3 conditions are true, we're not running the last 2 tasks. What I want to do is show how to edit this so any one of the conditions can be true, and I think it's slightly surprising how it works. What I would expect to have to do is to select all 3 constraints at the same time and right click on them. But actually if you do that, it doesn't help. The slightly surprising way you do it is just to select any one of them, and it doesn't actually matter which one you choose, and choose to edit that. At the bottom where it says multiple constraints, I'm going to change it so it's a logical OR. One constraint must evaluate to true. If I then choose OK, you can see that it changes the line of all 3 constraints leading into this task to dotted, which clearly shows that any one of them can be true, and in that case the last 2 tasks will run. To see this working now, if I run exactly the same package as I did in the previous part of the tutorial, but with a slight change to the constraints, you can see that when I choose OK, it's run the script and copied the file. Because even though all 3 conditions weren't true, at least one of them was. And that's the end of this tutorial on constraints. You can find lots more resources on SQL Server Integration Services, SQL Server, .NET and other Microsoft Office training at www.wiseowl.co.uk.